Okay, gang. All right, so we've come to the end of the first third of the class now. It goes for 10 weeks. We're just at the end of the third week now, with the last week kind of devoted to doing your finals. Now you've handed in, most of you, I think all you have handed in your papers to Toby, and we'll get those back to you very quickly. During the first third of the class, up to beginning today, we've covered what I've set forth is what I believe to be the upcoming secular crisis of the 21st century, which I've touched upon, having to do with the global climate change and the rise of a national security state, which is going to be being applied against people who are attempting to organize to try to stave off this major crisis, and also the potential confrontation in the 21st century here between the Northern Industrial Alliance of the Western powers in China, potentially resulting in a potential nuclear confrontation. We've also touched upon the role that I believe that the Constitution and its safeguards for us to do such organizing to prevent this major crisis, or to at least minimize it, the role the Constitution plays in protecting us and our ability to do that. In some detail already about the natural law worldview that undergirds the entire Constitution and will be providing for us a framework within which to attempt to assert our rights and protect them in the face of a national security state apparatus which is attempting to curtail and constrain those rights. And just in the last session, we actually touched upon briefly the larger context in which this natural law worldview obtains in the full spectrum of worldviews. We've actually then directed the first third of the class to these issues, getting you prepared so that in my sense you'll have a sense of why it is that we're putting so much attention on this Constitution, and why it is that I'm going to be paying so much attention to this natural law worldview as a thing that I want you to understand in depth, to be able to enable you to understand the constitutional rights and the arguments that you need to make to protect them against the assertions of a national security state, and to even extend them into areas where they may not have been elucidated yet. Phase 2 of the course is starting today, and we're going to be talking about the Constitution itself and its structures, its structure and its specific provisions in light of this natural law worldview. So that it's not going to be like just any other course you may have taken on the Constitution. And I want to do some inquiry on that, because I don't want to waste a lot of your valuable class time and educational opportunity going over a whole lot of rather more mundane aspects of the Constitution that you may well have already become familiar with. Either could be as far back as in your high school civics courses, and some of you may have taken some courses even on the college level about the Constitution. So I'll check on that in a second, so I can kind of adjust the depth that I go into with regard to particular provisions of the Constitution. But that's what the second phase is going to be about, kind of an in-depth diving into the Constitution and its structure and its provisions in light of the natural law worldview. Okay? And then in the third phase, final 3 weeks of the course or so, we're going to be directing our attention to how we apply these rights that we have seen in these understandings of the Constitution to actually provide tools for us to confront the major coming secular crisis in a more concrete manner. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to get some idea of, is there anyone here who has not studied the Constitution, at least in your high school civics courses? Okay, so neither one of you had any courses in high school about this, so there's 3 of you. Now, how many of you have actually had any courses in this, or any course that touches upon the Constitution at the college level yet? So there's like a dozen, more than a dozen. Like about I'd say almost a third of the class has had college level courses on this. So what I want to do is the handful of you who've never had any courses on the Constitution, I would recommend that some of you, a couple of you, are already going to be coming to the Wednesday study hours or office hours that I have, 2 of you. But others of you who have not had any deeper background in the Constitution, I would recommend that you come to the office hours on Wednesday at 5 o'clock from 5 until 6:15, where we have a smaller group of people who will be getting more detailed discussion about these things and questions that you might want to ask. Okay, because I think that'll be helpful for you. But I will be covering some of the information in general, but I want to be able to accommodate the full third of the class that's actually taken courses on the Constitution already, and the remainder of the 2/3 of the class that haven't had college level courses on this yet, but have some degree of familiarity with it. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be discussing during this middle third of the course the historical background of the Constitution and its specific provisions, how it is that these particular provisions came to be favored by the framers of the Constitution, and we're going to be dealing also with the more specific immediate historical background within which the Constitution was framed. We'll be dealing with the original constitutional, or the original Continental Congress, and the Articles of Confederation that were originally set up among the 13 colonies, why there were arguments that structure was not sufficient, and moving into the establishment of the Constitution itself. But most of the focus is going to be on the particular structure and content of the Constitution itself, specifically in light of the natural law worldview that we're talking about. And we're going to be focusing on, even though there are like 100 different aspects of the Constitution itself, even though it's not a huge document, there are about 100 different specific elements, but there are some specific ones that are of much greater importance than the others. So we're going to be addressing a lot of attention toward what we call the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments that were passed right within 2 years after the enactment of the original, ratification of the original Constitution in 1789. In 1791, there were a whole addendum. There were 10 amendments that were immediately made to the Constitution to supplement it, setting forth the Bill of Rights. And we're going to be concentrating a lot on those. And so, they're the classic First Amendment rights, that whole panoply of the right to the prohibition against the federal government enacting any kind of laws that restrict freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. These classics they're kind of paradigmatic constitutional rights. We'll be talking about those. We will touch on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, that there's been a bunch of discussion about, and a recent United States Supreme Court actually giving a rather unique interpretation to the Second Amendment, which historically it had not had, but it's a new vision of the Second Amendment. We'll be talking about that. The Fourth Amendment, which is the whole issue of the right of privacy, the area that ranges all the way from, when a cop stops you in your car on a Saturday night, do they have the right to go in and search through your entire car looking for your stash, or someone else's stash that may have been planted on you? that this all the way to, when a cop comes to your door and he says, you don't mind if I have a little look in here, do you? What are your rights with regard to telling them no? Or if you're walking along the street and a cop comes up to you and starts shaking you down and wanting to search you, what rights do you have over and against them? Other than avoiding being tasered or shot, which goes to the issue of one of the fellows' meetings with you. So this whole Fourth Amendment area, which of course also reflects very much on the issue of the privacy of your phones, your cell phone communications, your email communications, what type of searches you make on Google, what type of photographs you send back and forth among your friends. This is that whole Fourth Amendment area that is such a hot topic right now, because the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the other major agencies are insisting upon dragnetting all of this information, purportedly looking for terrorists. So this Fourth Amendment area is going to be one which probably deserves a lot of attention, and there'll be a lot of discussion here about that. Then there's the major Fifth Amendment thing. Now, most people, when they think of the Fifth Amendment, they think of the right not to be compelled by police officers to provide incriminating information against yourself. But the Fifth Amendment also has the original due process clause in it, saying that no person shall be deprived of their life or liberty or any of their property without the due process of law. And that entire due process concept has been transported over into the 14th Amendment, which is going to be another major focus of this center third of the course, this whole issue of the 14th Amendment, because it plays such a major role in the history of the Constitution. But the due process clause itself occurs in the Fifth Amendment over and against the federal government. And the 14th Amendment, as you'll see in detail, applies particularly to the state governments. And then there's going to be a couple other additional, there's the Eighth Amendment that people probably know some about, which is a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And there's a bunch of, I forgot the water. Patty, can I get a glass of water or something? Tobe, has anybody got any? Or can I steal some of yours? Terrific. No, I got it, Toby. Thanks. Thank you. I'll replace this for you, okay? Thank you. All right.
I'll go up and buy a bottle. To myself.
We're okay. Okay. Now the Eighth Amendment it prohibits the cruel and unusual punishment. Now it prohibits cruel and unusual punishment over and against the federal government. It has been imported into the 14th Amendment to apply against states, and there's going to be some discussion about this because you've heard a lot about these executions that are going on. The executions of so many people that have been found later by DNA testing that were completely innocent. The attempt to execute people with various forms of chemicals, replacing the electric chair where they used to fry you in the electric chair or kill you with cyanide gas in a gas chamber. This whole issue of whether or not the death penalty itself is cruel and unusual punishment. These are things that we're going to be discussing in light of the natural law worldview that we're talking about. And then there's the big two that we're going to be dealing with out of the Bill of Rights, which is the Ninth Amendment and the 10th Amendment. Now, the Ninth Amendment is going to be extremely important because the Ninth Amendment is the one that states that, look, just because we've listed this whole bunch of these rights in this Bill of Rights, in these first 8 amendments, does not mean that these are the only fundamental rights that the citizens have over and against the federal government, because there are indeed others, even though they have not been enumerated, because this is a fundamental premise of natural law, that there is a whole panoply of fundamental rights that citizens have over and against their government. And it is not incumbent upon the framers of the Constitution to enumerate each one of these. And that's what the Ninth Amendment says. So that opens a major door onto the issue of natural law and how one goes about discerning what type of a right might exist over and against a government, whether it's federal or state, in the face of a desire on the part of the governors to implement a particular law. Does it cover everything? I mean, if they were to make a law against wearing a green shirt, does that mean that we have a fundamental right to wear a green shirt? Or does it mean that the act is arbitrary and capricious on the part of the government because there's no particular rational reason why they should outlaw wearing green shirts? How do we undertake an analysis when confronted with a purported statute like that to figure out whether we have to have a right over and against it, or whether the government is without power to really do something like that? These are important questions that arise under the 9th Amendment. And then there's the 10th Amendment, which actually states that the federal government is a government of strictly delegated power and authority, and that the states, the people or the states, retain all the other powers that have not been delegated to the federal government. Now, you'll notice that, and we'll talk about this, that in the 10th Amendment, it says specifically that all of these other rights are retained by the states or by the people. And so there's a bit of a tension there. The question being, are the rights that inherently belong to somewhere other than the federal government, do they reside in the state or do they reside in the people? Or are those the same thing? So these are the classic Bill of Rights that we're going to be spending a lot of time on here in the middle third of the course, before we get into the deep background of how these particular rights all came to be enunciated and elucidated specifically in the Constitution, despite the fact that there were strong arguments being made for not elucidating any of these particular rights, because it would imply that only the ones that were enumerated actually exist. And so that became a major point of contention in setting up the Constitution. And so that's as I say, that there's there are 100 different aspects of the Constitution, but these are going to be the major aspects of the Constitution that we're going to direct our attention to. So what I want to do here today is I want to identify for you, and as I say, it's a little bit of a mix, because just a few of you this is going to be new to. A third of you who have actually had college level course on this thing is going to be old hat to you. And the other 2/3, this is something that you remember hearing about back in high school, but I want to make it clear that we all have a common understanding of it here. And that is that there are about a dozen major principles that when you get done with a course on the Constitution such as this, that if one of the other faculty members were to come up to you and ask you one of these questions and you didn't know the answer to it, I'd never be invited back to teach. So that there's some basic things that you really have to know coming out of a class like this. And there's about a dozen of these major principles that are the primary principles dealing with the Constitution. The first of these is that the Constitution is divided into basically two parts. That you got the first part, which is the Articles 1, 2, and 3, which are the original Constitution. It was passed in 1789. It was ratified in 1789. This is that document that they were working on that began in actually 1781. There existed in the colonies from 1776 to 1781 the Articles of Confederation, which we'll touch upon. But there was a felt need beginning in 1781 to actually begin a process of putting together a stronger constitution that bonded the 13 colonies together in a more coordinated manner. And so that there was this process that went on in drafting this Constitution that went on from 1781 all the way to 1787, and then they sent it out for ratification, and it was ratified by the states in 1789. And this is the affirmative positive government that was set up by the Federalists that wanted to have a stronger federal government than the original Articles of Confederation. And that this is the first half of the Constitution, as it were. This is the part that sets up the affirmative, positive structures of the government. Now, and it's also important to understand that in this this original section, it divides the government into 3 branches, which I'll touch upon in a minute. But the thing to focus on to begin with is that the Constitution is in 2 parts. The first part, setting up the affirmative government, and then the Bill of Rights, which is explicitly identifying restrictions on the power of this new federal government that is being set up. So there's the affirmative part of the Constitution in the Articles, and then there's the restrictions on the government itself in the second part. So there's 2 halves, basically, to this new Constitution. And Article 1, as I said, it sets up the first article is setting up the legislative branch. Now this is an important fact because there's been a lot of dispute about who the government really is. When you're talking about the federal government does this, the federal government does that, there's a great tendency to talk about the executive branch, the president and the several departments of the Defense Department and the State Department, and now the Department of Homeland Security and the other major cabinet level executive branches. A lot of people talk about that as the government. But there's a very specific case that was decided by the United States Supreme Court that happened back in about 1954, and it was Youngstown Sheet and Tube, it's called, and we'll touch upon it in the course here, in this middle third of the course. But it was a case in which, during the Korean War, the steel workers went on strike in Pennsylvania and struck against the steel mines. And President Truman took the position that you can't do this. You can't do this. We need to have this for military power. We need this for our defense. And he sent the United States military in to take over the steel plants and to make sure the steel plants kept running. And a major lawsuit was filed. And the government argued, the executive branch argued that they had to have the inherent authority to be able to keep the steel mills running in order to provide for the common defense. And the argument was made on the other side that Congress never gave the executive branch any kind of authority to do anything like that. And without some sort of congressional enactment, the executive branch was powerless to do anything like that, to go in and take over the steel mills. And the United States Supreme Court ruled that the latter was right, that it was the power, the inherent power to make legislation resided in the legislative branch, not in the executive branch, to take the initiative to make up laws like that. And so that the first article in setting up the new federal government sets up the Congress, making it clear that the legislative branch is the government of the United States. And it sets up in Article 2 an executive branch whose job it is to implement and enforce those laws. And then the third branch was the judicial branch. And it wasn't until later that the judicial branch asserted the right to exercise judicial review over the constitutionality of conduct on the part of the legislature or on the part of the executive branch. And we'll go into a lot of detail about this. But this was the 3 branches of the government that were set up in Part A of the Constitution, in the affirmative 3 articles that set up the Constitution of the United States. But in Part B, as I said, was the Bill of Rights. And this is the first 10 amendments that we'll spend the substantial bulk of our time here in the middle third of the course focusing on, so that you have a completely fluent understanding of each of those rights and some of the major cases that were decided about them. I'm not going to have you memorize a whole bunch of cases or all that, but I want you to understand the fundamental principles that obtain with regard to each of these fundamental rights. And I'll just go over for you quickly here today, and it's all recorded for you, so you can keep it, download it into some big file. I imagine what you'll probably do is download all the classes into one file and just keep them in your computer for later reference if you want to look at them. But everybody talks about these first 10 amendments as the Bill of Rights, and people know you when you talk about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment gun rights or the Fourth Amendment rights of privacy. People have some familiarity with that. But if anyone were to ask you, what is the 11th Amendment? Does anybody know what the 11th Amendment is? Any of those who have had the college level courses on the 11th on the Constitution? No. See? And don't feel bad about that, because nobody knows about what the 11th Amendment is. But the 11th Amendment is specifically prohibiting any of the states or any of the citizens of any of the states bringing an action in federal court to sue one of the other states. So what it's doing is it's setting up an immunity on the part of the states from being sued in federal court. And there are only very minor exceptions to that have ever been made, one of which is the 14th Amendment, which is why a lot of the litigation that is undertaken in federal courts against any state or any state employees is undertaken under the 14th Amendment, because there's a specific authorization that Congress has made to allow the states to be sued under that, an exception to the 11th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment is another one of these things. I won't embarrass you by asking anybody to tell me what it is, because you aren't going to know what it is. But the 12th Amendment is the one that got set up because they used to have in the original Article 2 of the Constitution, in Part A, they set up a procedure for electing the president. But they set up a process by means that was long and complicated. It's important to remember that the Constitution of the United States does not provide for the people electing the president. And the president is still not elected by the people. It's important to remember that. The president is elected by the Electoral College. The Electoral College is selected by whatever means the state legislatures want to use to choose their electors. But it's actually the electors who are selected by the state legislatures that actually choose the president. And almost nobody knows that. People have heard about the Electoral College, and there's this thing about, well, should we do away with the Electoral College? It's not really necessary, and it's just kind of, why do they keep it? You know, the bottom line is that it's reflective of a very specific attitude that existed within the framers that is contrary to a completely popularly controlled government, federal government at least. So what happened is they basically had a thing where when the electors were chosen by the state legislature by any means that they deemed to be appropriate, they were mandated to choose two people from each state legislature to propose for the presidency, one of whom could not be a member of their own state, a citizen of their own state. This was to keep every state from simply putting up one of their people to be the president. So they could put up one of their favorite sons, as they called them, to be president, but they had to recommend as well at least one other person who was not a citizen of their state. And then when the 26 people who had been nominated by the 13 legislatures were sent in to the Congress, then they would open up the ballots and they would add them all up. And so, for example, if Virginia had recommended Thomas Jefferson, plus they proposed Benjamin Franklin from Philadelphia, they'd send both of their names in, And if anybody in the other 12 legislatures voted for one of them, then they would get 2 votes. They'd have the vote from Virginia, and they'd have the vote from one of the other places. And so they would just add them all up, and whoever got the most votes was president. And then what they said was, okay, and the person who gets the second most votes is vice president. But what they discovered between 1789 and 1800, it didn't take them a long time to discover this, is that if you pick the person who came in second to be the vice president, that person is constantly jumping on the president and criticizing him and saying they disagree with them. And this became especially important when the political parties developed, which happened very quickly, because we're going to talk about that today. That the political parties arose, led primarily by Jefferson and Madison, who headed up the Democratic Republican Party, and the Federalist Party, which was headed up by Alexander Hamilton. And that this dispute broke out very early on, which is in fact reflected in the actual formation of the Constitution itself. Because you see in the Constitution, for example, this 12th Amendment that was necessary because they had electors in the legislature choose the president and not the people. So there was a tendency on the part of some of the founders to want to have the people have a much more direct role in controlling the government, rather than having the elite people that were members of the legislature do the choosing. So that tension existed right from the very beginning, and it basically ended up generating these 2 parties. Okay? The Democratic Republican Party, led by Jefferson and Madison, and the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton. And so that what happened is the 12th Amendment said that, look, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea to have the runner-up be the vice president, because they're going to be constantly attacking and criticizing the president. And so what they did is they had them propose a ticket, that they would propose a president and vice president, and they'd have to designate which one they wanted to have be the president or the vice president out of the 2 people that they sent up. And so that's what the 12th Amendment was all about, just to solve that problem. And so then you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now those were, the 12th Amendment was in 1804. This was like just 9 years or something after the whole thing got started. But there's this long span of time between 1804 all the way up into 1865 to 1868, which had to do with the American Civil War. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were all passed basically in that period of time, dealing not just with the issue of slavery, but dealing with the issue of the respective power between the federal government and the states. And so that entire mythology that you've been fed back in high school, that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, I think most of you, now that you're at the college level, know better than that. That the freeing of the slaves on the part of Abraham Lincoln was part and parcel of a much larger conflict that was going on between the states and the federal government at that time. Sophia?
But I've heard a lot of historians say that it really was all about slavery.
Well, people will say anything, so that doesn't mean shit. The fact is they say all kinds of things, but it's not true. And the bottom line is there was a major conflict going on about slavery, no doubt about that. But you have to remember that the issue of slavery also was a subset of the conflict going on between the agrarian southern states and the more industrial northern states. And so that when you have that conflict, it's not just about slavery. It's about the issue of agrarian interests versus industrial interests, and northern interests versus southern interests. And you have, in fact, over and above that, you have the whole issue of the argument about whether the states are going to be superior or whether the federal government is going to be superior. Because the federal government started falling more and more under the control of the industrialists in the North. And partly as a result of Hamilton succeeding in getting his national bank put in. But we'll talk all about this here in this middle third of the course. But the bottom line is that you will, and this is important, the question you raised, Sophia, is important because the fact of the matter is it's at this point in your educational career that you have to be prepared to be willing to dismiss some of the scholars. Because there will be scholars, allegedly scholars, just like there are people who debate whether global climate change is taking place. And I've recommended to you that movie, Merchants of Doubt, so that you can see that those people happen to be the exact same people that were hired by the tobacco companies to argue that tobacco smoking did not give you cancer, and to fight off the argument that they couldn't really prove it. They couldn't prove that it gave you cancer, or they couldn't prove that any particular incident of cancer was generated by smoking. And it turns out they're the same people that are arguing now that that global climate change is either not happening or it's because of a normal occurrence of all the ice in the polar ice caps melting, that they do this periodically, theoretically. Okay, so the bottom line is that you need to be discerning and discriminating about things that are written by different so-called scholars. And the same thing is true even if a particular professor gets up in front of you and proclaims a certain thing to be true. You have to be open to questioning that, other than in this class. That you have the advantage of having, well, I won't go into that. No. So the bottom line is I want you to be critical, I want you to be discerning, and I want you to be fully prepared to dismiss certain assertions that are being made, even in some kind of authoritative manner, but you need to develop skills of being able to present the counter arguments to show that that's not true, such as pointing out that the issue of slavery is a subset of the conflict between the industrialists and the agrarian forces, the banking interests that were largely involved in financing the capitalists in industry in the North, and that there's a whole set of other elements that go into contexting in a much less controlling way the simple issue of slavery with regard to the American Civil War. Okay, but these particular
I have a question about the 13th Amendment. It doesn't exactly abolish slavery because it says except with punishment, right?
Yeah.
So slavery is still.
Yeah. Well, that's because people that were put in. No, so that people, for example, that are put in prison are allowed to be put sort of in a form of slavery, so that they work on chain gangs, they build licenses, plates, and they do this other stuff, and so that they've got this kind of heartless kind of caveat in the middle of that whole thing, is that if you get arrested and put in jail, that you can be enslaved. But the bottom line is that the 13th Amendment was passed earlier on in 1865, specifically prohibiting slavery. But it was part and parcel of the offensive on the part of the northern industrial powers in suppressing the South. But then the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed after the resolution of the Civil War, in which they actually not only made black African Americans having equal rights, but in fact also crushed the states and subjugated the states to federal authority with regard to a whole panoply of different powers. And we'll talk about that in some detail because the 14th Amendment is so critical. Yes, Thomas?
So going back to the point between the difference in economies between the North and the South, isn't the reason why the South was able to keep an agrarian economy for so long after the establishment of the country because of the slavery?
Oh yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It was a subset. It was clearly an integral subset of the conflict that was going on between them. The southern major plantation owners kept insisting that they have a right to maintain slavery so they could maintain their economic position. And so the assault against slavery on the part of the northern industrialists, it was in fact part and parcel of removing the potential competition of the agrarian influences inside the government by taking slavery away from them and undermining them. So that's what I'm saying. But so it wasn't that the people in the North were that much more sanctimonious about this whole thing than the Southerners, because the fact of the matter is, even after the Civil War, the laws existed all through the northern states, prohibiting black people from marrying white people, having segregated facilities and all kinds of other things that still kept going on. So there's ample evidence to show that it wasn't, in fact, a genuine commitment to the understanding of the impropriety and appropriateness of slavery, but it was a subset of another major conflict that was going on.
There was slavery in New York City
No. In fact, where I grew up in northern New York, up in Lake George, that 50 miles north of Albany, the original capital for the country, that 50 miles north of Albany, any black person that was seen there 50 miles north of Albany was immediately subject to arrest on the presumption that they were on their way to Canada to try to flee from slavery, and so that they could be subjected to arrest, and they had to prove that they were not a slave. So the northern states were completely cooperative in this, and actually there was slavery in a lot of those different places, and that the conflict that broke out over the issue of slavery, as I said, was you look at it closely, and it's almost always occurring in the subset of some other major conflict that's going on, okay? And it's sort of a make-weight argument or a rationale for supporting the abolition of slavery. But I raise this because these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were passed between 1865 and 1868 play such a crucial role in understanding the shift that took place at that time in the entire constitutional fabric of the country with regard to the relative power of the states vis-a-vis the federal government. And then there were a whole series of other specific amendments that it's just important that you know what they are. And it was in 1913 that they established direct federal taxation. You'll see in the original Part A of the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, it specifically prohibits the newly created federal government from levying a direct tax on the citizens, so that they were not, in fact, given the kind of access to direct financial funding by the citizenry that would have enabled them to establish kind of an autonomous funding base. So that it was still considered that the federal government was there to, in a certain sense, facilitate the activities of the states. And the states were still preeminent in the constitutional scheme of things. And so that by 1913, which was just approximately 45 years or so after the Civil War, the culture had shifted to such an extent in the direction of the superior power of the federal government that that they were able to actually get the 16th Amendment passed, which actually authorized the federal government to directly tax the people, which gave them the power to hire a lot more people, to build bureaucracies, to arm themselves with more military vis-a-vis the states and everything else. So it was a classic spot there in 1913 when basically the federal government adopted a constitutional amendment which enabled the federal government to muscle up and to be self-financing. And at the same time, they then provided a direct election of senators, because even the United States senators, in addition to the President of the United States, under the original Constitution, Part A, even the United States senators in Article 1 were selected by the state legislatures. They were not selected directly by the people. It was just the House of Representatives that was selected by the people. And of course, to state the old canard, the fact of the matter is that it wasn't all the people that even got to select the representatives, because all the women were excluded from voting, all the black people were excluded from voting, all the Native American people were excluded from voting, all the Asian people were excluded from voting. In fact, the states were the ones that were allowed to establish the criteria pursuant to which a person could vote. Because as you'll remember, they voted for the state legislatures, and the state legislatures were the ones that voted for the senators and the president and chose them. And so that the representation in the House of Representatives was still limited by the state's rules themselves to white property-owning males. So you had to own property or have a taxable income, so that the states could say you therefore are a citizen because you're participating, your property is taxed or your income is taxed, and so therefore you're a functioning citizen. But that still only applied to white men above 21. So the entire group of people from 21 down to 18 were not allowed to vote. The women weren't allowed to vote, and only the white male property owners were allowed to vote. So a very small select group of people were actually involved in picking the members of the House of Representatives, and therefore picking the state legislatures, who picked the United States senators and the president. So this issue of exactly how much public participation was actually supported by the founders is a very important one for us to focus on here, because one of the primary issues we're going to be discussing here in the second third of the course and in the final third of the course is this whole concept of there being this kind of elite ruling class that views themselves as some kind of an aristocracy that is authorized to make all the decisions, and that our responsibility as regular people is just whether we basically trust them or give them loyalty or run out and are talked into voting for one of the two people they put up for president every 4 years. That's a major issue here in the Constitution. And so that you get in 1913, you get this dual event. Well, there's actually a three-part event that not only did you get the federal taxation being authorized contrary to Article 1, Section 9 in the original Constitution, and get the direct election of senators, but you also had the Federal Reserve set up at that time. And so this is the creation of that Federal Reserve, which was a function of Alexander Hamilton's desire to have this central bank, which we're going to talk about at some length here in the second third of this course. Then you get the 18th Amendment. That's by the by. 18th Amendment was the prohibition that came down. The 18th Amendment came down during the First World War, when lots of the guys were off getting killed over in Europe. And so the women's temperance movement organized and pushed through, along with the Methodist Church, prohibition on the sale of alcohol. And that was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which got repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. So you got the 18th and 21st Amendment just canceled each other out, but it's an event in history. But the 19th Amendment was a very important one, because the 19th Amendment was what, in fact, recognized the right of women to vote. So, and that was a function of this Chautauqua movement that I'll talk about. That was a major issue in the 19th Amendment. It's easy to remember because it's the 19th Amendment. It was in 1919, and that's when it was recognized that women had a right to vote. But it did not, in fact, extend other equal rights to women. It simply authorized women to vote to choose the legislatures. Okay? And then in 1953, they had the 22nd Amendment that limited a president to 2 terms. This is after Franklin Roosevelt had been elected to the 4th term. They ended up, after he died, getting a constitutional amendment passed limiting the terms for a president to only 2 terms. And then the 23rd Amendment was passed in 1961, which was authorizing representatives from the District of Columbia to actually sit as members in Congress, to have congressional representatives. And then in 1967 was the 25th Amendment, which actually was, strangely enough, just clarifying Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 of the original Constitution, which provided for the succession to the presidency. If the president gets killed or becomes incapacitated, what's done then? Does the vice president become president, or does he just become the acting president? And how do you go about picking a new vice president? It was a whole thing that took place in 1967. And they adjusted that. So they set up the thing now that if in fact the vice president dies, the president of the United States, pursuant to the 25th Amendment, will nominate a new vice president, and then the United States Senate has to vote on whether they approve them or not. And then the 26th Amendment, 1971, this is the one that extended the right to vote in federal elections to people 18 years old or older. Now, all of that came about because of the Vietnam War and all the big fight that was going on at the time, because our people were all arguing this is totally patently ridiculous to be able to draft 18-year-old guys and force them to go 8,000 miles away and kill total strangers and not allow them to vote. And so that the impetus behind getting the 18-year-old vote was simply to attempt to a desperate effort on the part of the people that were in favor of the draft to keep the draft going. But we finally succeeded in getting that stopped as well. So these are a range of the amendments, just so you'll know what they are. They'll be on record here. You can keep them in your notes, and so that if anybody comes up and asks you whether in this course you knew what the amendments were, you don't look like you didn't come to class. Okay, so those are the basic ones. Yes, Thomas?
Sorry, just to clarify, was that the 25th Amendment? Was the last one?
No, 26th. 26th. And then there's a minor 27th Amendment that doesn't mean anything either. Okay? But, okay, so those are the amendments to the Constitution other than the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. Okay? So that the first proposition to keep in mind, the first principle about the Constitution that you're learning in this class is the bottom line that it's in Part A and Part B. The Articles 1, 2, and 3 that set up the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And then the Part B, which is the amendments. The major important parts of which are the 10 Bill of Rights plus the 14th Amendment. And then all the rest of them. You know, not that they're unimportant. Certainly the 19th Amendment, recognizing the right of women to vote, is certainly not minimal. The other amendments are not minimal, restricting the president to 2 terms, etc. These are important, but they don't have the same type of scale that the others do. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that the Constitution of the United States is in Part A and Part B. One is the affirmative setting up of the affirmative powers of the government. The other one is recognizing the explicit limitations on the power of this new federal government. The second major principle, and we've touched upon it, is that the federal government is divided into 3 branches. And this is the separation of powers. This is the thing that you'll hear a lot about. And there's a lot of trouble going on about this right now, because this authorization on the part of Congress of just passing a resolution giving the president the right to attack Middle Eastern countries, like they did the authorization for the use of force that was passed by Congress to give W. Bush the authority to go in and invade Iraq. Because it's very clear under Article 1 of the Constitution that only the Congress of the United States has the power to declare war. And yet, there's this whole thing where they simply come up with a little resolution and give the president the authority to run around, including doing covert operations, around the world. And there's an argument that has been made, and we'll look at in the second part of the course here, that this is an unconstitutional delegation of constitutional power on the part of the legislature to the executive branch. That if the Congress wants to declare war on some country, then they can do that with a full understanding of how serious that is. But this idea of just delegating to the president the decision as to whether he feels like going to attack somebody is not necessarily in full compliance with the original understanding of the Constitution. But the three branches of the government that you hear a lot of talk about, and there's some validity to it, is that they were set up as checks and balances against each other, so that the legislature had its own unique powers under the Constitution, and that the President of the United States was just there to enforce those. There were certain other kind of powers that were given to the President, the right to initiate treaties with other countries, etc., to be the commander-in-chief of the military in time of war. There are a whole series of these things that are in Article 2 for the President. But the Article 1 powers are the legislative powers. What this did is this codified in a very pronounced way an historical development that had occurred in England with the evolution of the bicameral parliament. And we'll touch upon this when we get into sort of the deeper history of the Constitution itself, how these institutions came into kind of the conceptual sites of the founders, because there's this long history of the House of Lords in England, and then the rise of the House of Commons, the relationship that existed between the Parliament and the King at that time, and then the relationship between the King's bench being able to actually, pass on decisions that limited the power of the King, etc. There's going to be a long discussion of the historical development of these things, but the second major principle I want you to take away from the class with regard to the Constitution is that it divided the federal government into three separate branches, and they each had their distinct power. Now, clearly, with the onset of judicial review, which we'll get to in a minute, the judicial branch took on an extraordinary amount of power that it never had in England, and it never had in the original Constitution. It wasn't specifically given to them at all. And it's of such profound importance, it is quite clear that the founders, if they had intended to have the power of judicial review over both other branches, it's likely they would have said it. But we'll get to that. But it turns out that the second major principle is that the federal government is divided into these 5 separate branches, and that they act as checks and balances. But nowhere in here in the Constitution do you find the fact that the president, in selecting his or her Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State or other things, had to in fact send a nomination up to the Senate to have them ratify it. It's nowhere in here that one would assume on the face of the Constitution that the president had a right to pick whoever they wanted to be to the heads of their departments.
So sorry, would you mind giving a quick rundown? What are the 5 branches?
3.
Okay.
The 3 branches. The legislative branch, the Congress, the executive branch of the president, and the judicial branch. Okay, so
You said 5.
did I say 5? Oh, okay, well forget the other 2. Okay, forget the other. Okay, so the three branches of government. Okay, now the third major principle about the Constitution that you have to remember, and these are rather elementary, but I want you to make sure that you've got all of these things, and that is that it was a federal republic, that there were 2 very different governments that were operational with regard to each of the citizens. There's this new federal government that existed, and then there are these new states. That the states were set up, the constitutions of the states were actually drafted up in almost all of them around 1775 to 1776. That whole period when they were asserting their independence from England, the colonies that were originally charter colonies from the king, they actually set up their own new constitutions. And so that and it was the states themselves that had originally established the Articles of Confederation, which we'll talk about at some length, so that we understand what the original desire was on the part of the colonies to make sure that each of the colonies remained sovereign and had the complete authority to make decisions within its own boundaries. Okay? so that the delegation of additional power to the federal government in the new Constitution left the states with a diminished amount of sovereignty to the degree to which they delegated some specific powers to the federal government. But it still left the states with substantial power and authority and sovereignty. And so there were two sovereign entities now that existed in North America. There was the federal government and the state governments. So the third major quality of this Constitution, or element of the Constitution that's important to remember, is that the sovereign authority of the respective governments, the federal and state governments, was expressly recognized in the Constitution. And so it wasn't that a Constitution was set up which basically absorbed all of the states into one federal government that had sovereign authority over all of them. That wasn't the case at all. It was an equal balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. That's the third major factor here. Now, the fourth one, and this is the one that people find surprising, but we touched on a little bit here earlier, is the United States is not a democracy. Now, it's a very unpopular thing to say. You know, in fact, when they have anybody say it, no politician would ever dare say it, mainly because everybody thinks it is. It's not a democracy, and the fact is, it's not even a democratic federal republic, which you sometimes hear. It's a democracy with a federal government and the state governments, and it's Republican in the sense that it allows the people to vote for it. What it is, what our federal government is a constitutional, quasi-democratic, federal, representative, three-branch, bicameral, legislative republic.
What a mouthful.
Okay? It's what it is it's a constitutional, quasi-democratic, federal, representative, three-branch, bicameral, legislative republic. Okay, now you're never going to have to remember that again, but it's just so you'll know that that's what it is. That it's got these 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, these 8 different critical dimensions to it. Any one of which you can dive into at any given point, and looking out from that perspective, you can say, yes, that's what this is. For example, it's a representative government, which means that it's not a direct democracy at all. You know, if for example, with this Asian treaty, the TPP that they're talking about, the Trans-Pacific Economic Alliance that they're trying to establish right now, all they'd have to do is say, okay, we're going to schedule Friday afternoon, 1 o'clock Eastern time to be the voting on this. Everybody get your cell phone, and just like, calling into The Voice or whatever that other show is where people sing, that you vote right now. You can just send in your votes. And the fact of the matter is, they'd probably have as many people vote as vote in a popular election, and then they could figure out what the people think about that. But no, they're not going to do that. They're going to say, "Whoa, that's not for the people to decide. This is a very sophisticated thing. There's business involved. There's all kinds of lobbying involved. There's economics involved. There's international relations involved, and it's way, 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 way above our pay grade." And so therefore, they don't even feign having us involved in this. And the fact of the matter is, you can send in as many emails as you want to your congressperson, and they won't pay much attention to what you're asking them to do. What, Sophia?
So, hypothetically speaking, do you think that the state of the country would look better or worse if we had a direct democracy?
Oh, that's one of the things we're going to be discussing in the class right now. Well, all I'm saying is that it's important to note that it ain't that right now. That we'll discuss whether we think it should be, or to what degree it should be, or how we might go about making it more responsive to popular will. But at the present time, it's not. And you can see that we've already talked about it being a federal government. but it's representative and it's 3 branches and it's bicameral, which means it has 2 legislative bodies that need to have respective authority. And so that it's not a democracy and it's not a democratic federal republic. It's a constitutional, quasi-democratic, federal representative, 3-branch bicameral legislative republic. And at least that is reflective of some serious thinking that's going on the part of the people that are involved in setting this thing up. Now, the 5th and very important principle relating to the Constitution is this, that separate from its founding Constitution, the United States government does not exist. It doesn't exist by divine right. It hasn't been ordained by God. Nothing. It does not exist. It is a contract that has basically been set up by the people in the country to choose to delegate over to this federal government certain aspects of the governing functions of our collective community. And it has no inherent existence. And it has no inherent authority. It was established by the people, but as I've suggested, don't get too woozy over how romantic this idea was, because the women weren't allowed to participate, the black people weren't allowed to participate, the Native American people weren't. Nobody but a select group of white male property owners over the age of 21 who were involved in selecting the state legislatures of these colonies actually participated in making this decision. But the bottom line is they set up this particular government for a specific purpose, and they set it up with some degree of concern for popular rights, and it made it clear that they did. Now, a 6th major feature of the dozen features that I'm going to be articulating here today for you is that the colonial state governments didn't exist either, except through their constitutions. They were originally set up by charters from the King of England that actually signed an official charter giving it to a certain group of people to come over here to the North America and have set up a certain colony and have a certain type of relationship of sovereignty back and forth between themselves and England. And there was no coordinated function of the colonies among and between themselves. Each of the colonies had a direct charter relationship to the government of England, to the King of England. And those were dissolved. Those charter colonies were dissolved by the passage of specific constitutions on the part of each one of these colonies. And you can look it up. You can find out how they actually set these things up. But 99% of them were all in 1776 and 1777. Delaware, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, all of them. Some of them had formal charters of, like Massachusetts. They had a 1780 constitution that they had put together, so they were a little bit later than the others. But virtually all of them, between 1776 and 1777, created their new state governments by a constitution. And that you can see that those constitutions bore the same kind of attachment to the natural law worldview as undergirds and shoots through the entire constitution of the federal government. That these were governments of restricted authority, limited sovereignty. They were delegated by the population in their colony certain types of authorities to engage in, and yet they were all the creature of those constitutions. So there's no argument that somehow these entities exist by dint of the will of God, the divine right of kings, or any type of aristocratic delegation of authority to conduct themselves in any particular way. They were all set up by original charters by the king, which were dissolved by their new constitutions in 1776 or 1777. okay? And that the founding fathers, therefore, did not believe that these state governments, any more than the federal government that had been set up by the federal Constitution, were imbued with any type of inherent authority, such as had been claimed by the kings in Europe. The kings had all asserted that they derived their inherent authority to do whatever it is they wanted to do directly from God. Now, the reason that they seem to think that is because virtually all of them were ordained by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church used to have full ceremonies where they would ordain these kings and, in a sense, conduit down to them the authority of God that resided in the church. And so there was this direct linkage between the ecclesial authority of the church, the theological authority of the church and the Pope, delegating some of that to the king, and that it had come directly from God. And so that it's perfectly clear that in the creation of these colonies, and in the creation of their constitutions, and the creation of the federal constitution, that no concept like that was entertained by the founders. They did not view these states or the federal government to be imbued with any kind of inherent authority. They specifically stated that the powers and authorities that were not explicitly delegated to them in writing were retained by the people. Okay? And so that's a fundamental thing to understand, that this concept of the inherent right and inherent authority residing in the people is a fundamental aspect of natural law. The understanding of natural law that individual people in community have a right to govern ourselves, that we have a right to participate in deciding what it is that we're going to engage in by way of collective conduct. It's an inherent natural right that resides with the individual person, and it doesn't abide in any entity, such as a colonial government, a state government, a federal government, or any federal legislator. That there is no such inherent right. It resides in the people. And so the eighth concept to understand is that the entire document of the federal Constitution that we're talking about here is rooted in and generated by an adherence to the natural law worldview on the part of the clear majority of the people that were involved in drafting up these state constitutions and the federal Constitution. And these people were led by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Aaron Burr. There were a whole group of these people. But there were no political parties at that time. There was just this faction of these people. And they were all part of what was generally considered to be the Federalists. That they were people who were proposing a new federal government that was stronger than the original Articles of Confederation. But it's a complete mistake to think that all of the people who were Federalists with a small f, ended up being Federalists when the political party was organized. Because James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and these people, it's important to remember now, and here's one of these little known facts that you'll never have known about if you didn't attend this class, and that is that it turns out that the vast number of these men all studied under the same professor at the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton. That it turns out that this particular fellow, Reverend John Witherspoon, he actually taught a course on moral philosophy at the College of New Jersey. And he was the professor for James Madison and Aaron Burr, and for 5 different cabinet members of original cabinets of the American government, 37 federal judges, 3 United States Supreme Court justices, 10 cabinet members, 21 United States senators, and 39 United States congressmen. This one professor in one class taught all of these people about natural law. And so all of these people brought this fundamental understanding of the source of moral foundation for the natural law rights that abided in individual people. They all brought this same clear understanding to the process of forming these state governments and drafting these constitutions and drafting the Constitution of the United States. But it's important to remember a ninth concept is that among these other founders who were signers of the Declaration of Independence, were signers of the Constitution, there was in fact another faction. There was another faction that were secularists and that they were positive law adherents. And that they also believed in the oligarchy, that there was this superior right of an oligarchical group of people in the human family that ought to be authorized to govern instead of the regular people. That they viewed the regular people as being driven by passion, being uneducated, uninformed, subject to bribery and corruption, and that they didn't believe that the people themselves ought to be able to make decisions for the collective. That this ought to be done by an elite, specially trained, specially educated cadre. And these people were led by Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton became the first Secretary of the Treasury for the new federal government. And he, in fact, right from the very beginning, started advocating all kinds of policies that would have, in fact, isolated out this oligarchy. Now, you can tell from the articles, the Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, Part A that I talked about, there is, in fact, a whole vibration in there about this elite. That the state legislature are the ones that pick the president, they're the ones that pick the senators, that they're the ones that are in charge, and that there's an elite group of white male property owners that are over 21 years old that are the ones that pick the state legislatures. That there is this implicit understanding that this is not a popular, democratically controlled government. This is a government controlled by a certain oligarchy. So therefore, right from the very beginning, we see these two tensions. So that Part A of the Constitution that's set up with all of these kind of elite qualities of running this thing, in Part A, is immediately responded to by Part B of the amendments that put in these amendments explicitly setting forth the natural law understanding that is most articulated in the Ninth Amendment. That says just because we've enumerated specific fundamental rights that the citizens have over and against government doesn't mean that's all there are. In fact, there are other ones that we retain for ourselves. Now that is a paradigmatic assertion of the natural law principle. And yet you see it in the Part A and Part B. You see these two different thrusts represented right in the constitutional framing itself. And so there is this tension within the framers right from the very beginning. The so-called Jeffersonians, which really should be called the Madisonites, because James Madison was actually the guy who carried the principal vision of this whole thing. But Thomas Jefferson had written a lot about it. And Alexander Hamilton was very critical of their kind of soft-headed, spongy thinking attachment to this perverse concept that he kept referring to. He said this strange concept that they had about natural law, and he was very derogatory about it. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you for the class on Thursday, I want you to read a particular article I've put it, we've set it up for you today. We put it on the list today for you to look at. It's a fairly short article that was written in the American Political Science Review. Okay, and it's called Madison versus Hamilton: The Battle Over the Republican Form of Government in the Role of Public Opinion. Okay, this article, which I don't know, it's maybe like 15 pages or something like that. And again, I'm not going to be browbeating you to memorize the whole thing. You'll get right away what's being said in here. But it tracks this debate that goes on between James Madison and the students of Witherspoon and the natural law advocates and Hamilton on behalf of the mercantilists and the bankers, the central bank people and the manufacturers, that Hamilton was constantly attempting. And you're going to really smile when you read this article, because you'll see that it so closely reflects the kind of argument that's going on today, where you get the Republican Party trying to shift all kinds of tax money over to subsidize the major corporations, with military spending and oil subsidies and all of that. And that's what Hamilton is proposing right from the very beginning, that the federal government stimulate this mercantile class, this entrepreneurial class, and that there'll be kind of a trickle-down benefit economically for everybody else in the country. And Jefferson and Madison are leading the counter arguments on behalf of the regular people, and saying they don't want this type of privilege to be given to this elite mercantile class. Okay, and so that I do want you. There's the only one other article that I've been this strong about that you should read, even if it's only for your own edification. The other one was that big long article about natural law that I referred you to. Okay, that is by what's his name, Bremer. What was his name? Bremer or Bromer?
German guy?
Yeah, the German guy, Heinrich Romer. Romer. Heinrich, yeah, Romer, whatever his name is. The bottom line is that you would all be extremely well served in the course of your education to read that document. And you would be equally well served to read this article. Okay? And I want you to read it by Thursday, because this is going to be very important to the discussions we're going to have during this middle third of the course, because it sets forth very clearly and starkly this confrontation between kind of an elite, mercantile, central bank-oriented, capitalist view of running the government for their benefit, as opposed to the kind of populist view that Jefferson and Madison had. Okay? So that the 10th principle that I want to address here in just the last couple minutes is that the checks and balances that are structured into even Part A of the Constitution were both practical because of the demonstrated tendency that executive authority had all through history of moving toward engaging in these kind of arbitrary and capricious, self-serving actions on the part of the executive, the king, of taxing the peasantry to build a big castle for himself, and to raise armies to quest after more land for himself, etc. And also with regard to the legislatures, the parliament, and were prone to engage in kind of careless, overreaching activity, hurting the individuals. And there were also, with regard to the judiciary, the King's Bench and others were prone to engaging in non-judicious rulings, and that there needed to be some sort of way to oversee this whole process, so that the constraints that were placed upon the federal government through the checks and balances were both practical, but they were also even themselves philosophical, because there was this, you could see this tension going on even in the first three articles of allowing popular participation, at least on a limited basis, of the selection of the people who are going to run for the House of Representatives. Okay? And so that you can see that this is reflective of a concept that's going on around in the world at the time in natural law, that there was this expansion of people who were authorized to participate in the decision making that affected themselves. Okay? And just 1 minute. And then there's a very important one here, and this is the number 11th of the 12, and that is this issue of judicial review that I touched upon earlier, that there was no suggestion in the original Constitution that the judicial branch would have the authority to veto actions on the part of the executive branch or veto action on the part of the legislative branch. But this actually came about in a particular decision that was handed down by Chief Justice John Marshall in 1803. I mean, very early on in Marbury versus Madison. And he basically declared to be unconstitutional a provision that had been passed by the Congress in the very first Congress. That they passed the Judicial Act, the Judiciary Act of 1789, setting up a whole bunch of courts under the Supreme Court. And even though the Article 1 authorizes Congress to establish inferior courts under the Supreme Court, that it didn't authorize them to, in fact, authorize the extension of a particular power to the Supreme Court, which they tried to do in that statute. They tried to give the Supreme Court the authority to issue a writ of mandamus prohibiting the executive branch from doing a certain thing. So what John Marshall did, very interesting, there's a long set of writings about this, is that on the one hand, he declared that to have been unconstitutional, to have the Congress give the power to his own judicial branch to veto an action on the part of the executive branch. He declared that to be unconstitutional on the part of the Congress. And by doing that, he took upon the judicial branch not only the authority to issue future writs of mandamus against the executive branch, but also to issue, in effect, writs of mandamus against the legislature and the executive branch both. And so that this power that was taken by the judicial branch, by Justice Marshall in 1803, very early on, is a critical aspect of the judicial review, because the final principle I want to leave us with here before we start our questions and answers is that this actually established, as of 1803, a forum in which this debate between Madison and Hamilton could take place, between this natural law, worldview, egalitarian, populist perception of self-government versus this elite oligarchy of the mercantile class and the rich capitalist bankers and industrialists on the other hand. And that therefore what we're going to be tracking through this course is this debate that has gone on. And it's gone on in the judicial branch, and it's gone on under the rubric of the Constitution of the United States. Because the Constitution of the United States is filled with these concepts that are intrinsic to the natural law worldview. And so the champions of this populist natural law worldview basically seize upon these particular provisions in the Constitution and make arguments as to why, in fact, we ought to expand the participation of the citizenry in decision-making over our own government. And it's fought back against by the Hamiltonians, who are the Federalists, and now by the Federalist Society, to try to maintain control on the part of the oligarchy, which they show, look at the Constitution. They say, look at the Constitution. There's an oligarchy here. There's an elite ruling group that actually picked the president and picked the senators. That was the original intent of the Constitution. And so the reason that I point out these 12 items, and I come to the rest at this 12th item of the subsequent to the adoption of the principle of judicial review, that the courts, the federal courts in the United States, become the forum for the combat to go on between these two primary forces of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Okay? And I guess we'll open the questions with this parting thought is that, remember, one of the classmates for James Madison studying with Witherspoon was Aaron Burr, and he's the guy that shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. For a note, so you know where this is going eventually. Okay, so that's the kind of, drink from the fire hose overview of the structure of the Constitution and the provisions of the Constitution that set the subject matter for the second third of the course here that we're going to be having before we get into the final third of the course, which is going to be devoted to how we utilize the power of the natural law worldview, understanding what's happened down through the years in the federal debate in the court system to protect ourselves against the national security state, which is the tool of the Hamiltonians. Okay? So now you had one of the questions.
It was way back at your 10th point.
Yep.
Your 10th principle of checks and balances. You said something of the judges were being non-judicial. I was wondering what you meant by that phrase.
No, being non-judicious. That the King's Bench, for example, would almost systematically rule on behalf of the king whenever, in fact, anything came up. And it would always rule on behalf of the king's legates whenever they got into a confrontation with regular people. And so that there was a great deal of distress on the part of the regular people about the judiciary. They wanted to have some kind of control over the judiciary. Okay. 1, 2.
Your last point on 12, are you addressing the notion that we do not living in textual constitution?
Yes. Yes, that's right. The so-called living constitution is the endeavor to make real the principles of natural law, that when you have a Ninth Amendment, for example, that explicitly states on the face of it that these are not all the rights that we've got. We've got other fundamental rights as well. You have a very good standing to make an argument and say, well, don't you think that we ought to be able to articulate what those are and why they are? And so when you have a federal government or state government trying to suppress us, for example, passing a statute that no unmarried person is allowed to use birth control. And they say, well, wait a second. The textualists will say, well, where does it say anything about birth control here in the Constitution? It doesn't say anything about it. You haven't listed that as one of your rights over against the federal government. And we say, well, take a look at the Ninth Amendment. This is one of those. And so then they say to us, how do you get to that? How do you figure that? Well, it turns out I did figure that. That was one of the first cases I ever did, a case of Eisenstadt versus Baird in Massachusetts, that had a criminal statute outlawing the provision of birth control information to unmarried people. And so I got to argue that case while I was still at law school in front of the federal court in Massachusetts, and it went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in the case of Eisenstadt versus Baird, establishing the right of unmarried people to have access to birth control. So you're welcome. Okay? Okay? And your question. I don't think I said that. So tell me what you thought I said again.
I thought you said that their specific preference was for popular rights by stating that the Constitution of the United States does not actually exist.
No, I think you're conflating two different concepts. One of them that I said that the federal government has no existence at all other than it's being created by the Constitution itself. That it doesn't have any inherent existence, it doesn't come from God, it doesn't have any kind of inherent right to exist. Without the Constitution having delegated these powers to it, it would not exist at all. But what I said is that in the Constitution itself, there are numerous places where this natural law theory has been set forth as a condition upon the powers of the federal government. And so that one of the aspects of natural law is for popular government, is for the government of the people ourselves being able to govern ourselves. It's a natural law right that any community or group of people has. Okay? Yes?
So I know when we vote for president, the electoral college, like they get the entire state's vote for the electoral college. But do they have to listen to the popular vote? Like if
No.
for like the state?
No, they do not. There's no requirement whatsoever that the members of the Electoral College vote the way that the popular vote voted. Now, what they've done is they've set up a process by which there are different groupings of electoral members of the Electoral College, and you vote for those members of the Electoral College, and they're listed under a candidate. And so that they have, in a certain sense, pledged that they will vote for that particular candidate for president if you vote for them. But there's no way to enforce that.
Has there been like cases where they go against what they pledged?
Well, there have been a couple of cases where what happens is when the Electoral College vote doesn't give any one of them a majority, that what happens is then it goes into the House of Representatives. And it says that in the Constitution. If no person gets a majority of the electoral votes, then what they do is they take the top 3 vote getters of electoral votes and they put that to the House of Representatives.
Did that happen in 2000?
No. No, the fight in 2000 was all over the who was going to get the electoral college votes in Ohio and in Florida. That was the battle there, and no one was arguing that they weren't going to vote the way they said they were going to vote. In fact, both sides were obviously dependent upon the fact they were going to vote the way they were supposed to. That's why they were fighting so hard as to which group was going to get to cast the votes. Yeah.
I'm interested in this whole like initiative referendum process.
Yes.
That's like an example of direct democracy, but it's only at the state level, right?
Yes.
That emerged in the progressive area, but that's not a federal. That's a state.
It's a state resolution by a constitutional amendment usually.
And then a state cannot change their state constitution to disagree with the federal constitution, right?
That's right. That's right. It's an interesting question. For example, if in the referendum, someone were to propose a referendum that no black people be allowed to vote in the state of California, and they did that, what happens is the referendum goes in and it doesn't become law until the legislature takes a step making it a law. They're mandated to do it under the referendum, but in that particular instance, that's right. In that particular instance, if the legislature and the state refused to do it, nobody would stop them. But if they did do it, then there'd be an action against them. In fact, the whole thing with the gay marriage and stuff, that's what's going on in front of the Supreme Court, whether or not the referendum is authorized. Okay, the Right to Marriage Act and all that stuff. Okay. So I think we're at the end. As I say, I apologize for that being such a quick overview of everything, but I wanted to get it all up in front of us. But please read that article, okay? And then we'll talk about it on Thursday.
Where do we put paper?
To Toby.